Well, good morning or good afternoon to everybody, depending on where you're joining us from today. I'm Perrin Beatty, President and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and I want to welcome you to our fourth Executive Summit Series event of 2022. And it's entitled The Future of Responsible Artificial Intelligence. To start off, while we're meeting on a virtual platform, I'd like to begin by recognizing the Indigenous peoples of all of the lands that we're on today throughout Canada. I want to acknowledge the ancestral territory of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people, and celebrate the importance of the land that we each call home. Well, the theme of today's summit couldn't be more timely. Artificial intelligence, or AI, is one of the most transformative technologies of our era. However, most of us still know too little about how widely it's used, what sorts of firms are adopting it first or most effectively, or how organizations plan to apply it. This lack of reliable information has made it difficult to make predictions about the industry, which in turn affects our ability to make good business decisions or to develop evidence-based policy. Now, most importantly, as artificial intelligence becomes mainstream around the world, building trustworthy AI systems has become absolutely crucial. With emerging technologies like AI, factors like privacy, fairness, safety, transparency, inclusiveness, and accountability need to be top of mind for all of us. As we look ahead, one thing becomes clear. AI will be celebrated for its benefits, but also scrutinized and to some degree feared. Today, we want to look at some of the key questions. How can responsible AI support the adoption and practice of designing, developing, and deploying AI to empower employees and businesses? How can it fairly affect customers and society in a domestic and global context? What does AI mean for the future? What are the best guesses at how these technologies will change our world and our lives in 5 years or in 20 years? Now, to kick off these conversations, our first special guest will be providing a keynote address, followed by a short fireside chat, and then an audience question and answer. So be sure to note down any questions that come to mind. And you've received information, and we'll put it in the chat as well, about how to connect via Slido to put in your questions, and we'll be delighted to take any of those. Now, it's my honor now to introduce Ms. Catherine Luello, who's the Deputy Minister of the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat and the Chief Information Officer of Canada. What should be particularly encouraging to all of us today is that Catherine brings a private sector perspective to her work. Prior to her appointment as CIO on July 2021, she was the Senior Vice President and Chief Information Officer at Air Canada, where she was responsible for the information technology systems that support and enable Air Canada's global business. They may be trying to get you back there, Catherine, these days with the challenges there are in getting the transportation system up and running again. But in this role, Catherine additionally led innovation in the artificial intelligence space while maintaining the security and reliability of Air Canada's worldwide systems in an operational landscape that shifted substantially during the global pandemic. Now, from 2001 to 2017, Catherine held senior management and executive roles at major Canadian companies, including Enbridge, WestJet, and TELUS Communications. From 2018 to 2021, she served on the board of directors for Scale AI, which is the Montreal-based artificial intelligence supercluster that aspires to increase competitive advantage for Canada globally in AI, and from whom we'll hear more during today's panel discussion. Catherine has also served as a board member for the Creative Destruction Lab, as well as serving as chair for Health Canada's Industry Advisory Roundtable on COVID-19 testing, screening, tracing, and data management. She holds an MBA from Athabasca University and a Bachelor of Science from the University of Alberta. She's a proud mother of two and a fierce advocate for mental health, having served on the board of directors for the Center of Addiction and Mental Health Foundation. Catherine, that's an incredible CV that you bring to us, and we're delighted to have you today. And let me turn the microphone over to you.
Well, thank you, Perrin, for the very nice introduction. And I have had such a privilege to work for some organizations across Canada that matter so much to Canada. So whether that is, in a large country like ours, having a strong, healthy aviation business, energy, if you're about heat and you're about light, you're about energy, and there's a transition going on in energy across this country, which is very exciting to be in the government environment to watch, and telecom, which connects us all. So I truly feel privileged to have served in those organizations. And you noted a little bit that at the tail end of my career at Air Canada, I'd had a chance to start working with the government throughout COVID. And I can describe that as a bit of an itch that wouldn't go away. And, that transitioned my thinking after a really cool career in private sector around how could I take all of those learnings and adapt that into some of the largest problems we're tackling as a country as we emerge from COVID. And I speak to you today as someone who has 10 months of experience as a deputy in government and someone who's got just about 30 years of experience in private sector. So as we kind of talk this morning, depending on where you are, I'm happy to sort of go back and forth across those domains. Just a couple of things on AI before we jump in. One is not new, been around for a long time. In fact, has been part of the world for 25 plus years. And I think that's something that's important, is that this is adapting innovation that started many years ago and putting it into practical, useful terms in our context for Canadians to deliver better policy and better services. And for you as business leaders around how do you actually operate your business more effectively. Now, whether that's from a capacity, cost, or service perspective, I think the common theme there is we're adapting AI to drive outcomes, which is pretty interesting. The second sort of comment that I would make is AI is not about the tech, it's about the humans. In my experience doing this in a couple of organizations now, the biggest challenge that I have faced has been getting folks to trust the technology, trust the algorithms, and use it as a management support tool. And that's really where I think organizations need to start. It's not instead of management. It's not instead of engineering. It's not instead of really smart policy people. It's a complement to, and I think that's something that we can unpack a little bit in our discussion here today. And part of that is trust. People need to understand and trust what's happening in the machine, and explainable AI and understanding how you gain confidence in an organization to tune AI and ensure bias isn't introduced, and all of those things that we'll likely talk about today needs to be a practice. You can't just build it and then assume that people will accept and use that if they don't understand the math and the science that goes behind it. So that change management is something that is really, really important. And, I'll look to my days at Air Canada, like we were in a very substantive technical debt remediation program. And now for the non-technical folks on the bridge, what that means is we had a lot of old systems and we needed to move to new systems that allowed us to operate the next generation of the airline. But what was brilliant about Kalen was he carved out space with me to actually work on some AI labs, some prototyping related to AI, even while all these really big things were going on. And we were able to partner with many organizations, whether that was Vector, whether that was University of Toronto, whether that was Scale AI, University of Montreal. There's some great work going on out on the West Coast as well. Calgary's really starting to stand up a practice. Like we've got capability across this country that's unbelievable. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But we were able to carve out space and a very packed agenda. And I think that's maybe another core piece I'd leave leaders with. You have to create some space for this. It takes top-down sponsorship because it is something that doesn't necessarily show a payback right away. But let me jump to the end of the story here. We picked 2 areas that were not directly impacted by this really, really big system update that we were doing. Cargo, revenue management. We built AI models that work to support the organization to be different in that space. We did all the change management. We worked in partnership with different organizations. What do you think the airline depended on when COVID hit? Cargo, revenue management. Those AIs actually, without us knowing, paid dividends to how we were able to start to analyze data that had never existed before because we were able to tune and train and adapt. So it's just an example of the fact that you have to have the courage and the boldness in a very busy environment that everybody works in commercially to create some space for this. And to also have the courage to say, all right, lab's over, didn't work, we didn't prove the thing out, let's shut it down. And as a person that's worked in and around digital and AI is a component of that, that is one of the most difficult skills for organizations to master, is to stop something that is not deriving the outcomes they're looking for. That takes a lot of courage. And so that is a skill that as you think about building out your AI practice, you're not going to hit a home run on every time you build out an algorithm or a model. And you need to be able to have some parameters that say, we'll shut it down. Like, don't put good money after bad money. The last item maybe I'll speak to, Perrin, and then I'll turn it back to you because I'm really just looking forward to the conversation, is talent. This is something where talent is your friend. There is an incredibly rich landscape of talent in Canada. We should be so proud of that, and we should continue to invest in that. And part of the work that the super clusters were doing, and Scale in particular, I'm really pleased to see you have Julienne joining you as part of your afternoon panel discussion, is to actually not just fund organizations building AI, but to actually continue to support and build out the talent basis in Canada. And I remember speaking to one of my colleagues who worked overseas in the airline business who said, oh my goodness, we would absolutely kill for your talent in Canada. Now, do we have enough of it? Absolutely not. And that's a theme that I'm going to take an opportunity today when I've got business leaders from across Canada together to say, we need talent in government, and we need talent more generally across Canada in the digital space more generally. And anything that you can do within your organization to build up that talent, and that's part of what we did at Air Canada and even at Enbridge, that's going to pay dividends, not just to your organization, but it's going to lift our capacity as a country, which I'm very seized with in my new roles. So Perrin, with that, maybe I'll pass it back to you and we can just jump into the Q&A, but just really looking forward to the conversation today.
Catherine, thank you so much. It was fascinating. I was making notes here as you were going along. You've covered so much of the territory that I wanted to ask you about, including I want to come back to the question of talent in a minute, because it's a concern that you have in every aspect of business right across the country, but it's particularly acute in some of these areas, and how we meet those needs is going to be a real challenge for us. Could I start though? The other thing I noted that I want to come back to is you mentioned the challenge of stopping things that don't work, and risk management is something I want to come back to as well. But can I start at a higher level in a sense? What constitutes success with AI? We've all heard of it. Everybody understands that it's something that's going to be critical in the future. People are still defining exactly what it means for them and for their organization. And we tend to look upon it as the latest magic wand that we can wave to solve our problems. But we have to do it right, as you were pointing out. What constitutes success? How do you plan for this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, how I would define success, and certainly how I've described it in the past, is you're driving a different outcome, you're making different decisions, or you're able to automate something that you weren't able to automate before. Ajay Aggarwal is someone out of University of Toronto who I've got a huge amount of respect for, and I had the benefit to spend some time with him, and had him actually spend some time with the Air Canada board on AI, because they were very interested in exactly the question you just asked. And there's a great book called Prediction Machines that talks about the fact that AI actually creates value in prediction problems. So where you have a problem around prediction in your business, that's where you should think about, how can AI help me move through that decision making more quickly, or can take out of the way the decisions that don't need to be made by a human to serve up the larger discussions and decisions that need to be made. And I sort of at the front end said, the largest challenge that I have seen, and take that as a sample of one, in AI actually driving true business benefit in organizations, is getting the humans to use it and not have it be something that runs to the side, but I'm still going to do my thing over here because I've been doing it for 25 years. Do not underestimate the change management, the need to bring along people in operating differently. And, we used to
We've seen
talk
that,
about
Catherine, in so many different technologies,
100%,
where
but more so in
is the icing
this.
on the cake somehow,
Yeah,
and we'll go back to doing things the way that they used to. But
you
you're
got
talking
it.
about something that's cultural change at the end of the day.
Very, very much so. And, we've all sat around with our analysts who pull out a spreadsheet, and, or you've sat in a meeting where you've got, one executive's got that maybe has one number and another executive that has another number. Like, data is hard. Data in large organizations is very, very hard. And that's probably the other piece that, if you want to step away from the culture side and say, like, what are some of the preconditions, like junk in, junk out, and, setting up the data environment within your organizations, and your CIOs or your chief data officers or your chief digital officers or heads of IT should be accountable to work with the business groups to ensure you've got a healthy, stable data environment. And you would think, well, that can't be so hard. I'm telling you it is. It's actually one of the more difficult parts about AI, is ensuring that you've got really good data in, because your algorithm, your tool that you're building, that depends on the information you feed into it. And that information needs to be good and clean and accurate and trusted is probably the thing that's at the core of that. So those things, even so, back to, you need to know when to call it a loss. Even if the AI doesn't do what you want, expect, or need it to do, the data cleanup activity alone creates enterprise value for organizations. Like, this is one of the adjunct benefits of going down this path, is that the healthier an organization's data is, the better equipped they are to have good insights into that data. Data is a huge strategic asset for organization. It is for the government, and it absolutely is for organizations. And AI, you can think of as almost the icing on the cake that allows you to move out of manual manipulation of data into automated. And then, you go down the pipe of machine learning and all the sort of continuum of where AI takes you. That was a very long answer. I'm sorry. I will try to be more succinct in my future answers.
It was a fascinating answer. I suspect people were taking copious notes as you were giving it. You're still relatively new to government. You've had the experience in the private sector, which is great, and you bring that to government. How is the challenge of implementing AI systems in government different from the challenges in the private sector? Scale, presumably, is one of those. But are there other challenges that are different?
Yeah, a scale is certainly a factor. You won't understand the scale of government until you're in government. Like, I say that 10 months in, that anything I would have thought that would have prepared me did not. Like, there's just a scope, a scale, and a complexity. There are certainly some things that I was very aware of and mindful of as a private sector CIO that I have exactly the same view, which is ethical, unbiased, explainable. All of those things really within the government context get embedded into our policy documents. And so it's perhaps more structured in terms of how we ensure that we've got those things driven into policy. It gets put into program design. And I think the other piece that I would observe that's slightly different is you've got different risk profiles between a private enterprise and government for some good reasons, and for some that are very cultural. And so part of the thing that I would observe within government 10 months in is that there is less comfort with prototyping and failing and trying something, as there should be. We are dealing with taxpayer dollars, so there's a sensitivity around ensuring that we're spending those in a really responsible way. But that bias towards not taking risks doesn't lend itself to this type of technology scaling. I think the other piece is we have very vertical data within government. So you've got your data that employment and social development has, CRA has, the science departments have. It's the nature of how government's set up. So in the business construct, think about having a holdco that's got many different businesses. How do you transit information back and forth is not easy. Do that 200 and some times. And that's the environment that we're in within government. And the legislative authorities don't exist in some cases for us to share data. And we're very mindful of the privacy implications. So a lot of this work needs to be done in concert with our privacy organizations, both provincially and federally. So it's, to use a term that my old CEO used to use, it's like playing 3D chess in full view of the public. He used to say that often. And that is very much, as we go into the very early stages of AI in government, I would put us in the very, very early stages of that we're mindful of ensuring that we are being transparent and open and all of those things that we want in a democracy.
So for a variety of reasons, speed of implementation would be a major difference, that you'd be driven by the marketplace and in the private sector to move as quickly as possible. And you have fewer of the constraints that you're mentioning. I think another understandable factor is that government tends to focus on process, whereas in the private sector, you're very focused on outcomes.
Very, very much. I think that there's a certain difference around, there's part of me that would say I miss quarterly board meetings and analyst calls, and the other part of me that says I don't, because they drive different cadence. And when you think about the services the government offers versus the services that industry offers, there is differences in the drivers around those. And, by necessity, we move slower. Part of what I'm hoping to bring to the conversation, and it's been welcomed by my deputy colleagues, is that digital mindset around being able in a lower risk environment within government, which exists in certain cases, ability to not have the big heavy thing, but move a little bit more quickly. Because good begets good, right? Like if you can show results and people get excited about it, they're more inclined to take that next risk and that next risk because they see the benefit. And if there's one thing that I have concluded working with the people that I get a privilege to serve with every day, is they come to work every day wanting to do a great job for Canadians. And that's how we have to frame these types of interventions, is this is how it will help you do that better. That's the conversation, not about the tech. It's a lot about the data, but it's ultimately about what service gets delivered. That is, I think, where we're flipping the narrative around a little bit.
And that's what's so critical. Too often we get focused on the inputs rather than what happens with the customer. You mentioned the question of ethics. Are you satisfied that both in the private sector and the public sector, that institutions that are implementing AI have an adequate understanding of the ethical considerations and that they're building in protections there as they should? Or is the scenario where we're feeling our way along and where we're going to be seeing very serious ethical challenges?
Yeah, it's a great question. And like I started off with, like, this isn't a new space, but I think there's things, I'll speak for myself personally as a Canadian, that I am becoming more and more aware of, where you have hidden biases, you have things that you didn't know as a Canadian that are becoming tuned into how you interact in a physical environment with people. And I think that at the end of the day, humans code things. And so that is something that we need to pay attention to, is that even the best intended developers bring their own biases into the equation. Now, what I feel comfort in is we're having this conversation. There are frameworks that certainly we're using within government. We do an algorithmic impact assessment on these AIs. It's a policy instrument that we use. We do peer reviews. We do things that tie our policy back to law and administrative items. So we are putting controls in place to ensure that at least that's a live conversation. And then there's that constant tuning of an AI where you've got, again, it's not a fixed system. You have constant opportunities with an AI to improve that. Like, that is the value of an AI. It gets smarter over time. The more you feed it and tune it and train it, the better your outcomes of prediction are going to be. I think to the degree, we were very early days in it at Air Canada, very early days in it at Enbridge when I was there. To the degree that you can take some of those frameworks, and there's really great collaborations that go on through the CIO Strategy Council, which I chair with another very prominent Canadian leader. There is resources available to your organizations to institutionalize some of those things and have you tune them for what makes sense for you and the customers you serve. So the best advice, Perrin, I can give in this space is, as an executive that is encouraging and driving AI, it can't just be about the shareholder value at the outcome. It's got to be about all the culture change, the making sure you've got ethical, understandable, describable AI. It's got to be that package, right?
It's not something you add on afterward. It has to be an integral part.
By design.
Closely related, well, not closely related, part of ethics is the issue of personal privacy.
Right.
How about, you mentioned privacy earlier in your remarks. Do we fully understand the privacy implications? Are we properly protecting people's privacy? And is the legislative framework under which privacy is being protected adequate today?
Yeah, it's a great question. This is a live conversation, has been for multiple years. And, I had an opportunity last week in Ottawa to spend some time with experts in industry through the chambers, actually, on this. And this was a big component of the conversation. So first, I would say, certainly from a government perspective, engagement with the privacy commissioner has been an active conversation around not just privacy in the construct of AI, but privacy more generally in the construct of just data that we hold as it relates to Canadians. And there's a framework within government, and then there's PIPEDA that we dealt with as private industry, and I've kind of dealt in both now. There's also sort of the ecosystem around Canada, GDPR, what's going on in California, that we are global businesses in a lot of cases, that you need to sort of understand and appreciate where legislative guidance is going. Quebec has actually just introduced some legislation as well. So it's a dynamic space. I think the question that I posed at the session that we need to ask ourselves is twofold. I do think that we're at a point in the digital economy where we need to have a discussion around truly what is personal private information and what are the benefits to Canadians around being more open and sharing that information. And that ultimately comes down to service. So I think about the things I do as a Canadian who doesn't want to necessarily wait in line at the borders. I give them my biometrics so I can have my nexus, so I can go through the thing and do pre-clearance and all of those things. It's just one example. That's a choice though. I'm not required to do that. That's a choice, but I see a value proposition from a service perspective. And I do my own risk assessment inside my head and say, that's a good risk. And come on, kids, you're doing the same thing. So I think that's part of the conversation. The other piece.
For 1 second.
Yeah.
That is an active decision you're talking about there, to share your information,
right?
The quid pro quo, that I'm able to get through the lines more quickly. So there's a trade-off people consciously made. But so much of AI, you're using passive data, but the potential for invasion of privacy by your ability to construct profiles, for example.
Yeah, and that's kind of exactly where I was going. Is I think that there needs to be like a national curriculum, and like I'm out of my space here now, so I'm going to acknowledge that this is more my personal opinion, but I think I've got some basis and background of which to have this opinion. Is when you think about the volume of information our kids give out on any given day. Like I have a 21 and a 23-year-old who have lived their lives online. They give out a whole bunch of information, some passively, some actively, to your point. And I think there's a national conversation that needs to go on around how we educate Canadians to be citizens of a digital democracy, like not passive citizens, active citizens. And so, that to me is something that is a private, federal, provincial, territorial, municipal conversation that needs to go on. And then I think it really does go, now put my government hat back on again, like the premise of open government. Like I've got accountability within my role for digital, but I have access to information as part of the portfolio, privacy is part of the portfolio, and open government is part of the portfolio. In my opinion, those things all go together, because we can solve some of our access to information challenges by dealing with some of the privacy, open government questions we have in front of us. So to me, it is about educating, transparency. And as we start to think about digital credentials to allow you to access multiple services across Canada and certainly within the federal family, that's a big part of the discussion. Is okay, if as a citizen I want to have a trusted identity that allows me to do a bunch of different things, I want to know what those things are. I want to have visibility, and I want to be able to remove access, like some of those basic principles. So as we go through some of the legislative reviews, and as we go through some of the things unrelated to legislative review, those are just some of the things on my mind. And as I said, those are live conversations with the stakeholder communities that need to provide input into that, including Privacy Commissioner.
I want to get to the audience questions because a number of them have come in, but I have one other question I want to ask you first. We were going to talk about the issue of skills. You mentioned earlier that we have wonderfully talented people, but not enough of them.
Yeah.
How's the government dealing with this, and what advice can you give to the private sector in terms of the attraction of people with and holding people with the skills that they need in such a hot area?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in the AI space, it's hot, data space, cyber, but development, project management, like anything required to deliver digital programs. We felt it at Air Canada, a bit of a different labor market when I was at Enbridge. We are certainly feeling that in the government. And like, I don't think this is an easy fix. This is going to be a generational fix. And we're going to need to think about where adjacent skills can get retrained. And a lot of the large firms in tech are actually doing doing some interesting things in this space where they're training adjacent skills. Certainly some of the things on my mind are, we've got a very robust immigration process, and how do we actually bring the skills into the country? We've got wonderful educational institutes, but not all kids want to go through that track. So how do we create a certification or learning track that allows people to get skilled up in these core areas that we need to get skilled up in. The other thing, and this is maybe a bit of a heads up to you, Perrin, likely this afternoon I will shoot off to you and other corporate leaders across Canada a request to say, like, we are looking for people to come and do tours of service within government. We've talked a little bit about this. And as someone who's just in the early days of the privilege of taking a really cool private sector career and being able to contribute to some things that really matter to Canadians, I see the benefit of having that cross-pollination. And the US does a pretty good job of this in terms of moving people in and out. And I think we have this beautiful opportunity as Canadians to cross-pollinate. And, we don't need to have someone come in for their career. I'm happy to have someone come in for 6, 12, 18, 24 months and work on a really meaty program that could help a specific industry. So as an example, it's because I'm familiar with it. You think about aviation, air transport, what's sort of the state of play there. There's things the government wants to do to make that easier. There's things that the airports and the airlines want to do to make that easier for Canadians traveling and people traveling in and out of Canada. It's important to our country for that to happen. How wouldn't it be wonderful if we could take the best resources from all those organizations and do something that helps everybody? And to me, the long pole on building out capability right now is talent. It's not will. Funding can be solved. Talent is the thing that's going to allow us to move fast. So it's that sort of, how do we get more people in the pipeline? How do we look at different people than we normally look at in the pipeline? How do we build, from a younger age that this is a career and provide alternative ways of doing it? And working in a virtual sense has opened up markets that I think across Canada, where people maybe don't have to come to a big major center to work in a job in digital. That creates a whole different dynamic. And it would be beautiful to have Canadians working for Canadian companies and working on Canadian problems within the government. Like, that would be really exciting for me, to be able to attract some of that talent in for a tour of service to government.
You'll have our full support on that.
Excellent.
I'm a
Thank
fan
you.
of executive interchange, and there's no better example than you. You bring some party that somebody who had been within government the whole time would not have had. You bring a perspective that is critical in understanding what the needs of the private sector are. And were you to go back to the private sector with the knowledge that you've gained in government, there again, it would add value for the private sector. So any way the Canadian Chamber can collaborate, we're glad to do that. Let's go to questions and see how many of these we can get through. There are a number of them coming in. You've created a lot of interest. So we'll do them as quickly as possible. Do you know of any cities that are using AI, and can you give examples of any?
Oh my goodness. Off the top of my head, I don't, and I probably should. So I said to Perrin at the beginning, he's likely going to ask me a question that stumped me, and there is a very good example of that. But I do actually have an opportunity with all the leaders of the provinces and territories, and there's a member that has got accountability for representing the municipalities. I'll ask that question and educate myself. So I'm sorry I don't have a good answer for you, but I'm going to find out an answer for me. So thank you.
That's as good an answer as you can do. And it's one that we don't hear often enough from government.
Okay.
The next question was, with the stark increases in cyber threats, attacks, and breaches, can you share your insights on AI-driven cybersecurity and possibly provide examples?
Yeah. All organizations across Canada are dealing with this, as is the government, and the world's not getting any friendlier in this domain. I don't need to tell you that. So, I'll make one kind of plea or pitch. If you're on here, you're a CEO or a chief operating officer, and you don't talk to your CIO or your CISO regularly, you need to. You need to have the insights of what they know about cyber, because we have a lot of really smart cyber people in this country, and we have an incredibly strong asset in the communication security establishment, and particularly our cyber center, who works very directly with many of your organizations, if not all. If you go back to sort of AI being automation and prediction, that's a big part of a cyber defense strategy. So when you think about sort of what's embedded into software, what's embedded into firewalls, what's embedded into all the tools that we put in the environment to sniff out bad things, absolutely, prediction is at the core of that. So I used to talk a little bit about the percentage of things that you block on an automated basis, and it's in the 90++%. Like if you didn't, you would not even close to be able to keep up with the volume of knocks on the front door that we get and all of you get, frankly. So, from my perspective, this is a very target-rich environment for this type of intervention, and it's being it's being used to advantage to automate as much as we possibly can. And I note in the chat here, City of London is building an AI model. So thank you for me learning something on our call today. I really do appreciate that, particularly around the issue of homelessness. That's exactly where we should be focusing efforts on. So thank you for whoever posted that.
Benoit, thank you for sending that in. It was something I didn't know either, so we've both learned as a result of this.
It's a big world. It's a big world and complex world. You can't know everything, so it's good that you put the pieces together and you know a little bit more.
We learn something every day. What are the strategies used for non-tech people to be comfortable with technology change, and what can we do in terms of attitude towards new tech? And this is something that's as old as technology, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. This is I think one of the most important questions that we need to ask ourselves as business leaders in Canada. What annoys me as someone who has the privilege to lead and support technology teams is that we expect business people to speak our language, and that is not fair. You should be expecting from your technical groups an ability for them to translate between the business problem that you're trying to solve and how they're going to apply technology, data, AI, all the layers that go into it to help you actually deliver better outcomes. And if your technology people are not talking to you about your revenue, your customer satisfaction, your cost, your unit cost, your efficiency, then you're not having the right discussion. And so the best thing that I would encourage, and we're sort of going through this in government as well, because executives are executives, is the best thing that a business person can bring to the discussion is a clear articulation of what good would look like if there was an intervention to help improve those things that you keep your eye on from a metrics perspective. And tell your technology person that. Not helpful to say, hey, I think we should go to the cloud, because that actually is a topic as big as, we should regulate. These are big topics. I think the other piece is there are some really helpful resources for business executives. There are programs for business executives, like technology for non-technical executives, that I would strongly encourage. It's offered in many different spots. There's also some great reading on cybersecurity around board governance. And that's, in my opinion, a really good place for senior leaders to start around what are the types of questions that you should be asking your technology team. And, maybe last thing is, your technology people don't know everything about revenue management. They don't know everything about network planning. They don't actually know how to fly an airplane. They know technology. Don't think that they expect you to know everything about servers and storage and network connectivity and user design. Be comfortable saying, I don't know what you're talking about. Could you please explain that in layman's terms to me? And they will, and it's a good way for you to develop your technical groups to actually participate in a more strategic way, because whether we like it or not, all business and all government is supported by digital. It's supported by technology, data, and all the things we've talked about today. And we've got to figure a way to have a more strategic conversation around asset management, investment, service delivery, policy development. And the best way to do that is to have your technology people as appreciative of what you're trying to accomplish as they are, the thing that they're trying to run. They need to be excellent at that. You need to be excellent in the business space, but there's got to be a meet in the middle. And be curious and ask questions. And don't be afraid to say, I don't understand or I don't know. You got to see that live and in person today.
Catherine, we're technically out of time, and the chamber staff has just pulled the rest of the questions from Slido to prevent me from doing what I'm going to do and squeezing in one more question. One of the questions that had been asked was you had mentioned the importance of knowing about discontinuing things that aren't working. When do you know? How do you know when to pull the plug?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to setting yourself very clear parameters on gating and when you hit certain milestones. And, if you don't, having the ability to have a really honest discussion around, is this something we can fix, or is this something that we need to sort of pull the plug on? And I'm a huge fan of prototyping. I'm a huge fan of not trying to do the big thing, but do a whole bunch of little things, because it's a lot easier to pull the plug on a little thing than it is on a big thing. And I think it really comes down to back to maybe where we started, culture. And I think having those conversations around the fact that in the digital AI space, not everything's going to be a home run out of the gate, and that you've got an expectation of failure of 10%, 20%, to even put a metric around it creates an environment where people are like, okay, well, it's not going to be the end of the world, because there's actually an expectation that part of pushing the envelope and moving fast and learning is falling down. And kids don't stand up the first time, walk, and never fall on their butt. But at a certain point in our adulthood, we forget the fact that failing is part of learning. So, I think it is about making sure that we're having those right leadership conversations, and that leadership is working with the delivery teams to say, and by the way, it's not just a slush fund of things to do. Like, you need to have firm parameters that we're going to measure against, data that we're going to look at that's going to tell us whether or not we're on the right or wrong track. So you're into a bit more of an objective versus a subjective conversation.
Catherine, what a great conversation. We've just scratched the surface. But
yes, we have.
Which is going to continue over the years ahead. And it's one which is of growing importance to Canada, and certainly to every business in Canada. All I can say is that the government certainly hit a home run when they attracted you into this portfolio, and all of us are the beneficiaries of that. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, and thank you for your dedication to the country. We're really looking forward to working with you.
Thank you very much for having me, and you're in for a fun, action-packed afternoon. So I hope the rest of the session goes well. Really appreciate the time. Thank you.